Coming up on Kismet.
Couple therapist needs to be able to deal with the relationship, not just do individual therapy with two people in the one room.
Welcome to the Kismet podcast, where we explore your world of post-divorce reinvention, connection, and your pursuit of passion. Join us as we navigate love's second act.
Hi. Welcome to the Kismet podcast.
Thank you.
Where we seek to understand the intricacies of enduring relationship challenges and explore the path not just to survival, but to thriving. In my own journey, it was a transformative process. Survival, definitely the beginning, revival, embracing life, and ultimately now thriving. Today we have the privilege of talking with Evelyn, a retired counselling psychologist who dedicated decades to the delicate art of couples therapy. Absolutely a tightrope, I have no doubt. What sets her story apart is her remarkable journey. Despite her extensive professional experience, her own marriage spanning nearly 5 decades eventually unravelled. This significant event had a profound effect rippling through her friends, acquaintances, and even across generations within her family. Now, here's the spoiler alert. Evelyn not only navigated the challenging terrain of a marriage's end, but has flourished beyond imagination, discovering a love that transcends her wildest dreams. Welcome, Evelyn. And to kick things off, let's start with a glimpse of your early years when you were first married. You were pretty young.
Yes, I met my husband when I was 19, and I remember saying to my mother, how do you know when you're in love? And she said, oh, you'll know. And I said, well, I think I love him because he kisses well, he dances well. And she said, you're a moron. And I think she was actually right. I was brought up in a household where women really needed to get married and have children. And I was advised not to go to university because I wouldn't end up finishing, but just to get married and have babies and do the right thing. And that was sort of like, that would have made my mother happy, would have made her feel she'd been a good parent. So I got married at 20 and did all the right things, had a baby pretty soon. But then after 2 children, I was incredibly restless and frustrated. And I remember standing in my kitchen, brand new home, kicking my kitchen cupboard doors closed. And I said to my mother, I'm really unhappy. And she said, you should thank God every day you have a beautiful husband, 2 wonderful children and a brand new home. And I knew that she didn't get it, but I also didn't get it. And I decided, I had a fire burning inside of me, and I went back to university as a mature age student because I felt unfulfilled.
Wow.
And I remember clearly the reaction of my friends who were incredibly non-supportive. They said things like, we wouldn't go back and study because that's the end of your marriage. That would be the end of your marriage or one's marriage. And I remember my parents asking my husband how he felt about me going back to study. And luckily for him, he said, fine, because I knew I was so determined that I would have walked straight out of my marriage, dragging the 2 kids with me. And these were the early days of the feminist revolution in Australia. I remember going on International Women's Day marches. I'd go to the disposal store, buy white overalls, dye them pink, and go marching with the 2 children.
You took the kids?
Yep.
Did they have memories of that, do you
I'm
think?
not sure. I've never discussed it with them.
I'm sure they would. That's remarkable. So you did university.
Yes.
And what did you study?
I studied psychology. First I went back just because I was bored, a bored housewife, and I fell in love with studying. I went to university when I was 17, 18 and studied social work, but I didn't finish. I got married. And then we transferred to Melbourne. So I didn't finish university. Instead I had children, had babies. So I did the right thing that society expected at that time. And then when I came back, I just picked subjects that interested me at Macquarie University and really fell in love with psychology. So I still only did it as a hobby. But I was there part-time for 9 years, 9 years studying part-time. So
a 9-year hobby.
Yeah, 9-year hobby, got 3 degrees and never looked back.
And then you started practicing.
So I would work for the government from 9 to 5, and then I would tear into my private practice and see 1 or 2 people after a full day's work, and then go home and cook dinner and whatever.
That's incredible. I didn't know that you had worked so hard and such long hours. How did you cope with a young family when you were?
They were, by that stage, they were sort of teenagers, so they were reasonably independent.
Mm-hmm. And how was your marriage through that time?
My husband was surprisingly supportive about my studying and working because I contributed financially. Because I felt, men and women needed to be equal, I saw that as my role.
Yeah, great.
As a woman, yes.
And you ended up going into couples therapy. That's something that you specialised in.
I did, and I don't even remember quite how that happened, but I remember one client telling me, this is when I was still working for the government, he said he realised he was just about to face his third divorce and he'd always blamed the women. He thought it was always the woman's fault. He hadn't married the right woman. But now he realised the only common denominator was himself. So I thought that was pretty insightful.
I think that's really insightful. Yes. And so you then went along a path for many years being a couples therapist. And who informed your approach to treating and working with clients seeking couples therapy?
I was very interested in, can I mention some therapist names?
Yeah, great.
I loved what David Schnarch had to say because he talked about the hourglass and what couples tend to do. They fall in love and that's the top of the hourglass, and they are consumed with hormones, natural hormones, 9 very powerful hormones that the brain secretes that make you feel young and sexual and beautiful and disinhibited, whatever.
The love hormones,
the love hormones,
oxytocin,
that's
norepinephrine,
right.
Yep.
The stage of limerence, and then you get to the narrow part of the hourglass where there's conflict, but conflict is normal in any relationship that lasts from short term to long term, and it's often at this stage that people do one of 3 things. They either bludgeon their partner to death with nagging, or they shut down and withdraw from the relationship, or they start having affairs. I think and if you can not leave your marriage but actually focus on yourself and what you might need to do differently rather than focusing on your partner, only then can you get through that gridlock, he called it, and that's to the more mature state in a relationship where you can deal with conflict and cope with difference. Often people can't cope with their partner being different from them. Then the Gottmans, wonderful Gottmans, whose research is very evidence-based, 40-odd years of research on couples. I learned a lot from the Gottmans. I did many, many courses in America and Australia with them. Then Havel Hendricks, I thought his Imago concept was quite interesting. And Ellen Bader and Peter Peterson also. Lots. I've learned lots over the years. Yes.
I like the hourglass analogy. I think of that in a couple of ways. That new love at the top when the glass is full of sand and it's kind of this overwhelming feeling. This person totally gets me. You get to the crucible, and my memory, and of course you're correct because you're the counselling psychologist here, is the withdrawal. And we can all do a combination of these things, these 3 things, but there's one thing that we tend to draw on probably the most. Withdraw, addict, which is the distraction and affair or alcohol or exercise, the distraction, and then the blame, which you described as nagging. It's all your fault. And exactly to your point that once you understand your own conflict style, the third part of that hourglass is when you get to the bottom, and the love that you feel at the bottom is so much greater than the love that you experience at the top. It's
different. And one of the things that people often don't know how to do is to what the Gottmans call self-soothe, how to calm yourself down when you are in a state of arousal, when you are overwhelmed with hormones and you can't think straight, but then you start getting defensive or aggressive, verbally abusive, physically abusive. And I tell you who else also influenced me was Gary Chapman. He talked about the 5 love languages. And that was a very useful concept because he talked about physical affection, buying gifts, affirmations, say things like I love you, quality time, or physical affection. And if your love language, which is something you learn from your family of origin, if people in your family gave lots of kisses and hugs, that's your love language. But if you marry somebody who came from a family where there were acts of service was how people like doing things for each other, then you're not going to speak the same love language. And we tend to give our partner what we need ourselves. So I remember coming home from work and my husband, and I'd had a huge day at work, and my husband would say, come and sit on my lap and give me a cuddle. And I would rather want to hit him because had he said to me, what can I do to help, he would have got his cuddle. But he didn't think like that and I didn't think like that. So
that's a really interesting way of resolving conflict in relationships. And once you realise what your partner's love language is, then that can be a key to less conflict. And you mentioned conflict before and the self-soothing. As a psychotherapist and working in that space with couples, I perceive that a lot of times people as couples are coming in when their relationship is in crisis and they're in high conflict.
Well, the Gottmans say that people usually have conflict for about 7 years before they come into couple therapy, and then often it's, you're dealing with very conflicted, upset people who often are so disturbed by what's been going on for so long that it's been quite hard to then change the dynamic. And I just was remembering Esther Perel. I loved her work, and couples would come in wanting to point the finger at their partner, and she taught me to ask, she'd say things like, before we discuss the problem, what is it that you think you do that might make it difficult to live with you? And then she would say, the second question would be, what are some of the vulnerabilities that you think your partner might be struggling with? So just from those two answers, she could tell whether they were busy into being self-righteous and finger-pointing or whether they actually had any self-awareness at all.
And did you use that approach?
Oh, all the time. It was marvellous because one of the reasons I think couple therapy often doesn't succeed is because it's more complicated than individual therapy, and because you're dealing with two people in their emotional world. But you need to be able to, a couple therapist needs to be able to deal with the relationship as well as the two individuals, not just do individual therapy with two people in the one room.
And I think that's something that might not necessarily be thought of or accepted across the community, is that there is a me, a you and an us.
Exactly.
And the relationship's the us.
That's exactly right.
And so if somebody's coming to you after this conflict's been happening, as you said, on average for 7 years, how would you go about initiating therapy apart from that? So say somebody arrives, I remember being in couples therapy myself, and the therapist, I think, started with something like, are you here to improve your relationship? So you take it away. You know what I'm about to say, I think.
That was question number one for me. So, what brings you to me? Are you wanting me to help you get out of your marriage? Are you wanting me to help you create a new relationship together? Or are you wanting me to help you stay the same? Because sometimes people would say, I don't really want to be here. I'm only here because my partner's threatening to leave, which is very common. Often men don't want to come.
And is that because, therapy's kind of aligned a little bit to more women, a little bit more because we're more expressive and more verbal? I know that's a generalisation, but oftentimes it can tend towards a women's style of communication.
Well, that's true.
And so how did you deal with a couple where somebody was like, I'm just here because I'm appeasing my partner, I don't want the marriage to resolve? And
well, the Gottmans had a wonderful questionnaire that if one had done the training, you were entitled then to give it to your clients. And they did it individually and they didn't compare notes. And then I would get the results, they wouldn't get the results, and I would discuss it firstly with them separately and then together, and that sort of gave a framework for the couple therapy so you could see the strengths and the weaknesses. It was actually quite useful, and it was evidence-based after their 40-odd years of research.
Yeah,
so
they're incredible researchers.
Yep.
And so were you able to help couples successfully navigate their way back into
some
meaningful?
yes and some no's. If they were having an affair that they didn't want to talk about, then I wouldn't see them as a couple.
Right. And so would you find that out because, and I'm just trying to clarify how you would go about couples counselling. Would you see each person individually? One partner might reveal to you in an individual session, oh, by the way, I'm having an affair and my partner doesn't know.
Yes, I would see them first as a couple, then I would see them separately. Then often I would give them that questionnaire. Then I would process what came up in the questionnaire with them as individuals and saying, if you want me to do couple therapy with you, then we need to bring these issues into the room. And if you're not willing to discuss the affair or whatever, then I'm not willing to continue seeing you as a couple.
And do you think that would have indicated to the unaware partner that, I mean, how would you explain to the unaware partner you're no longer welcome to therapy because I can't?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure because I don't know that it actually ever came up, because either the partner that was having the affair would say, well, that's it, I'm not coming back, or they would be willing to actually open up and discuss it, because if they were, painful as it might be, it meant that there was a way forward, because most relationships do not break up because of an affair.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
That's
Tell me some more
Gottman's
about
research.
That. Right. So people's marriages can survive.
They can survive, but it depends how the affair partner behaves. If they are remorseful and able to be empathetic to their spouse and really understand the pain and the damage and the mistrust, and it takes time to heal, then they can create a whole new relationship. And we looked at the reasons that the affair might have happened.
Right.
Which is very interesting too, because sometimes, although you might be married, you can feel very alone, very misunderstood.
And so that it informs the marriage about moving forward.
That's right.
You need to be better. It's not just one person.
That's
it's
right.
Both of you. It's the us. The marriage is as a separate entity almost.
So in a way, couple therapy was also sort of individual therapy in the room with the relationship. And then there was a guy that I was introduced to through the Gottman work, Dan Wiley, who if you had a couple who really communicated very badly, then you would take over the role of what the person was trying to say, and you then say it to the partner. And it was quite interesting. You know, it's like, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of anger, but if I could allow myself to be vulnerable and share this with you, then would you be able to hear me differently? And although I'm not doing Dan Wiley a service at the moment, it was very helpful, because you would speak for the client that really couldn't communicate, and it was often the male.
Okay.
Couldn't communicate the feelings.
A lot of moving parts.
Yes.
A lot of moving parts.
And that's exactly why couple therapy is pretty complicated and difficult.
Yeah, very difficult. And you mentioned before, one of the things that you, if a couple decides not to be together, the husband walks out, I'm not coming back anymore, or you did separation counselling. What was that like? Separation
counselling, I had a lot of enthusiasm for if a couple decided they really didn't want to be together, because I was worried about what would happen in the years moving forward with the children, because a lot of unresolved pain gets played out through the children and bad parenting, and I didn't want to see kids destroyed, and often that's exactly what ended up happening.
Why do you think that is?
Because there's a lot of unresolved anger, and I think that if a couple are willing to separate, go through the process of separation counselling, then they can see that although they don't want to be together, they want to do the right thing by their children, and they once did have love for each other, rather than just now they've got all this pain and anger and they're going to be spiteful and take it out on the children.
Right. So if you observe that in a relationship, in separation counselling, what are some of the strategies you might give to a person or a couple who are experiencing such, I mean, it is a really traumatic time. You know, your family's changing, everything's changing, your life is changing. So what are the strategies you might suggest?
Well, I might need to see them individually as well as together. Now, some of my colleagues wouldn't do that, but I felt that if you had a couple and the couple were doing separation counselling or marital counselling, and they went to separate individual counsellors, and you've got 3 people involved with one couple, and I think it became too complicated because each therapist might operate within a different framework. So at least I knew what was going on, and I also was a systemic therapist, so I felt I needed to look at generations, how the couple, the lessons that they'd seen from their parents' marriage, how they parented their children, how they communicated with each other. All of that I felt was knowledge that I needed to have, and diffusing that with 3 therapists I think would have been too hard.
Really
or
difficult.
2 other therapists.
And I like, the reframe of that you were there to advocate for the children. If you have a family and there is such high conflict between parents, that you were really an advocate for them. And did you see some good outcomes?
I did, but I was just thinking now of one couple that came where the husband was a very rational, cognitive, unemotional male, and the woman was a very emotional woman whose needs were not being met in the marriage, and she would take it out on the daughter, the little girl. And he used to protect the daughter, so the wife continuously felt undermined, and that was a really tricky dynamic.
And in the relationships and all the couples that you saw, was sex and intimacy something that was talked about very much?
Absolutely, because I used to ask people about their sex life because that told me a lot. If people didn't communicate with each other in the lounge room, the kitchen, the whatever, then they weren't going to have healthy sex in the bedroom. And often, and it wasn't just men who complained about lack of sex, it was often women too.
And so how would you address that in therapy? What was probably a common thing that came up? You weren't having enough sex, you wanted more.
I'd ask them, tell me about your sex life. And I was actually quite surprised that there were many young couples that hadn't had any sex for years.
Years?
Years. And they said they weren't having affairs, so I don't know what was going on, but they weren't having sex together.
Sex and intimacy is very different.
That's exactly
but if somebody's married, you would hope that there would be both. It would be a marriage of both. And I think, one of the things, if you're not actually having intercourse, and there might be reasons for that, hormonal changes as you get older, or the birth of a baby when you're younger, but for whatever reason, sex might just not be on the table at that particular moment. How important is affection, at that point?
Well, I think it's absolutely critical. And often there was no affection, no touching, no kissing, no cuddling, nothing. You'd be surprised how many couples didn't even kiss, let alone cuddle.
And so what would you do if a couple came in and they had been married and young or old and they hadn't had intimacy or sex for, like you said, years?
David Schnarch used to use as one of his strategies, and I did that in the therapy room, and it was quite interesting. You have to hug each other. Not allowed to talk. You just have to focus on yourself and what happened. So I get them to hug, and then I could tell by their body language. It gave me a lot of information. Then they'd have to hug for a few minutes in the therapy room, and then I would get them to sit down, and then I'd get them to talk about how that felt for them. And it was quite an eye-opener, and for the partner to hear what that was like.
And so would that open them to a first step if they're not having that contact?
That's right. It was a first step, yes. And I'd have often, one partner would be turned sideways, not a proper cuddle, looking out the window, looking at the watch, and I could tell that
timing the hug.
They weren't physically really involved. They weren't connected. That was the point.
And so how would you help them become more intimate? I mean, I'm guessing intimacy would be a first step before you'd say, by the way, you need to go into the bedroom and bang every week.
Well, interestingly, often men would ask for sex when they were feeling they needed a hug. They didn't know how to ask for a hug. So women need to be hugged. They need a lot of physical, often affection before they're willing to have sex. And men weren't aware necessarily of that they needed to have that hug, that kiss, that cuddle before, so they would just ask for sex straight away.
what would be the strategies you'd tell them to adopt to create greater intimacy?
Well, I'd be surprised, for instance, that often couples would have family dinners with the TV on and they wouldn't even talk to each other. So that would be, rule number one, you need to have quality time as a family, no television, and the couple needed to go on dates and talk to each other. Not about business, not about the children, but talk to each other. Spend quality time together, doing fun things, not to discuss issues.
Yes, I remember a therapist years ago said when I was married, you need to spend a minimum of 4 hours together. There has to be a 4-hour block that you spend together. And I thought, that's easy, a 4-hour block. And especially when you've got young children and your daily life is consuming, work and all the things that you need to do, to take that 4 hours, not watch a movie, to actually interact. Yes.
I think the Gottmans talked about, 5 hours a week you had to spend, but it didn't have to be in one go. And they talked about little things mean a lot. So a hug here, a pat on the bottom there, a kiss, just little things add up to
a
closeness. A connection, exactly.
Bids for connection, I think the Gottmans call it. A bid for connection.
A bid for connection, yes.
So I think just an example I remember from the Gottmans is if a couple's having an argument, they can decide to have a break, or they can, semi-resolve it, or still both be quite emotional. But if one of the partners is making a coffee, would you like a coffee as well? We're still married. I don't like you right now, but that's a bid for connection. I'm still going to be kind to you in a small way so that we know that we're connected. I think there's a lot in that. When couples come to therapy, I can only assume there were some couples that would come in and you say, this is absolutely not going to work.
I'd say to myself.
You would say to yourself. What would you do in that situation with the couple?
Try to help them communicate to each other in a way that maybe they could create a new relationship together. It would be pretty pathological for me to actually think to myself, this is never going to work.
Yes.
But if I did think that, because they were so stuck in their self-righteous pain, that I would ask questions to help them get to that decision themselves. I don't think I ever said to anybody, you should leave.
When couples that were in so much trouble coming to see you, was there a particular or common theme or something that you noticed brought couples to therapy more than anything else?
I think often it would be the woman dragging the wife, dragging her husband in, because the wife would say she has felt unloved for years and now she wanted out. And the men would say, but you've never told me that. And the women would say, but I've been telling you that for years. I've been unhappy. You haven't heard me.
Right. And do you think that's the fundamental difference between men and women?
Yep. I think I don't know if it's a fundamental one, but I think it's a big one. I think it might be the way the women communicate to men.
And so with all of this incredible knowledge and years and years and years of experience, your own marriage went through difficulties, and after a long, long time. So you were together with small children, you got your degrees, 3 degrees, your children were growing, you were in this marriage, and then your marriage didn't necessarily work out. And that would have been, I imagine, quite a big thing for you with all the skills that you have.
That's exactly right. And I remember another therapist friend of mine said, stop trying to get him to understand, because I said, we're struggling and I feel that I just haven't quite got the message across. And she said, stop trying to get him to get it. He's not going to ever get it. And she was right. He didn't.
In spite of all your therapeutic skills.
That's exactly right. And I think I kept trying, as well as dragging him off to other therapists, to try to see whether we could make it, but we couldn't make it. And I must say it was quite a challenge for me, because here I was saving other people's relationships and couldn't save my own.
Yeah, how did that feel?
I had to save myself.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So you had to save yourself.
Yep.
It wouldn't have made the time after being together with somebody for so long. There's routines and daily life and families. I imagine, tell me what it was like. Was it still traumatic, or was it a relief? How did you feel?
It was pretty traumatic. Telling my kids,
who were older?
They were older. They were adults married with their own children, and their reaction was quite surprising. Their reaction, and I was quite nervous about telling them, and they said to me, their reaction to me was the same. Both of them said to me, "What took you so long?" Which I found amazing, liberating. It was very painful, because I was letting go of something that I knew and stepping off into the big unknown, and it was complicated.
If your children were saying what took you so long, I'm imagining that they're supporting you in moving forward on your own, but the paradigm shift for you, a completely different life. How did you go about that?
Well, I had the structure of working, and I had a lot of support from my children. My friends' reaction was quite interesting. I think it challenged a lot of their own marriages. They were like, "Oh my God."
Yeah, if you've been together for so long.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm trying to remember back. It was quite a long time ago.
Hopefully you will remember what it was like to go dating again. Did you? I mean,
not really. No, I was determined I didn't want to go dating again, but I was very lucky that I was able to take up a friendship with somebody that I'd known for over 50 years who was single, and we supported each other. He had just lost his wife. I'd let go my marriage, and we moved forward together.
And do you think working in the space that you're in, being a couples counsellor, kept you in a place where you're like, there's more to do here, there's skills and things I haven't tried?
Yes.
And then you said, the children who were adults with their own children were supportive and good and stable in their own marriages. I can imagine the dynamic has changed those. So family dinners and celebrations, does your ex-husband attend at the same time as you? How did your children who are adults resolve that? Do you have separate family functions?
We do both. We have separate and together. My ex-husband, I think he struggles with it. He's had lots of different partners since we've been separated, but he hasn't had one. I'd like to see him happily settle down with somebody, but he hasn't managed that. I think it's been a bit tricky for my kids now, seeing how rude my ex-husband can be to my current partner. So sometimes it's easy for the children not to have us in the same room.
Right. And how are your children with your current partner?
They love him.
Yeah. Great.
They love him, they respect him, and they see that I'm happy. So if I'm happy, they're happy.
Oh, that's fantastic. And the grandchildren?
They love him too.
Yeah. And do you think your grandchildren were affected by the breakdown of your marriage?
I think my oldest granddaughter found it pretty confronting. But no, I think they've all accepted it. They understand. I don't know how much they know about what went wrong.
And it's years down the track.
It is years down the track.
You've moved on with your life and you're absolutely thriving. It's such a pleasure to see.
Well, I'm so lucky. I feel very privileged and lucky.
Well, I think a lot of luck is from hard work. And I think you put the work in and finally you're reaping the rewards, and it's just a pleasure to see. So thank you so much for coming today. Just as we finish off, any insights in particular for people moving forward through separation? Would you encourage counselling? What would be an insight, a takeaway for somebody who's struggling in their marriage?
I think don't give up on your relationship too quickly. I think you might not want the relationship you've got now, but I think there is always room, if you're both motivated, to create a healthier relationship that works for you both. And I would definitely research which couple therapist you go to. I would highly advise somebody who has been Gottman trained, because I think that makes the Gottman's research.
The evidence-based.
And it's evidence-based. Their therapy is evidence-based, and it makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. So insightful. Loved it.
Pleasure.
And you're retired. So no one can come and see you.
I've come out the other end.
Congratulations. Thank you for being here today.
On the next episode of Kismet.
And that's something that you want to avoid. If you aren't using those muscles correctly, then they're much more likely to atrophy.
Don't miss an episode. Hit subscribe where you're getting this. Follow our socials and ask any questions on my new website where we're building for like-minded people wanting to reconnect.